Hello everyone, my name is Yogesh, and in today's lecture we will be covering interface and the interview question related to it. Now starting with the definition, an interface look like a class but with no implementation, or you can say definition. It only contains declaration of events, methods or properties. The reason interface only provide declaration is because they are inherited by the class and structure for which it is mandatory to implement each interface member defined. Now why the main reason is why interface only have declaration. The reason is the interface is always inherited by classes or structures. Now there is a condition when anyone is inheriting them, it is mandatory for them for having implementation or definition. The reason is we cannot have method or property with just declaration but with no implementation. So that's why in like the class who are derived class who are implementing that interface, it is mandatory for them to implement the interface members. Now interface act as a digital signature of class. We will cover this definition while going through the practical, and it will make more sense to you. Now let me skip up the slide. Now starting with why do we use interface. First thing is enforcing standardization of vocabulary. Now for this I have an example built. Now what I did is, suppose we have two classes, one is SQL Server and second is DB2. Now suppose the person who has worked on SQL Server is different from the person who has worked on DB2. Now they both have used different naming convention, like name of the methods. Now first one used connect DB, and for saving the record he used save. Now for the second class the person used connect DB2, and for the second method for saving the record he used add record. Now the problem with this approach is, when you are working with like 10, 20 or 100 developers and on different classes, and each one of them will be using their own naming convention on vocabulary, then that will be a big problem for your project, because later it will make more difficult to understand the same project. Now how to solve this problem? By enforcing the vocabulary. Now for enforcing the vocabulary cannot be just vocally said, we have to make it some way so that it is mandatory for everyone to follow that rules. Now for that what we have is, now we have this interface named database. What I did is I have just declared two methods, one is connect and save. Now if you see here, we don't have any definition or definition or implementation. Now if I try to compile the code, it will say interface member cannot have a definition. So interface can only have declaration, not the definition or implementation of any method or any property. Now what we did is we just said like we need two methods, one is connect and save. Now instead of writing this class directly, we will enforce developers to use this interface. Now what if I just don't implement this method? If I try to recompile the code, it will say error, does not implement interface member save and does not implement interface member connect. So it is mandatory for them to implement the interface. So when you are implementing the interface, and if I just debug it again, now it will give exception for the second class because the second class haven't implemented it. So when it comes to implementation, it is mandatory for the derived class to implement the interface. Now by this we are enforcing a standardization of vocabulary, because no one can override, you can say ignore what they have to use. Now if they are implementing the interface, it is mandatory for them to implement these methods, and later you can tell them or provide a documentation like for this method for connection and all you have to use this method for saving record, and so it depends upon you. But with this interface on the code level, we do have enforced this standardization of vocabulary. I think I make that more clear. Now coming back to the interface, the reason in the definition, the reason interface only provide declaration is because it is they are inherited by the class and structure for which it is mandatory to implement each interface. So now we have covered this. While any class is implementing the interface, it is mandatory. Suppose I just remove this save method from this and I try to recompile it. Now it will say does not have interface member save implementation. Now we do need to have implementation, only then our project will be compiled and successfully built. Now coming to the second one we have is decoupling. Now I think now there is one more lecture of mine on factory based design pattern. I will be showing same example today for telling showing you how we decouple the project. But for like in detail you want to study the factory pattern, just refer to that lecture. Now in this project what I did is we have two classes, A officer, like A class officer and B class officer, and each one have some basic salary and something, and according to their like class, there is some formula which is getting their pay back, like generating their pay or something salary. Now what I did is I just created an interface which is like get pay, and what I did is I implemented this get pay within these two classes. Okay, this interface is been implemented by these two classes, means this method is implemented by these two classes. Now I have one more third class. What it is doing is it is returning, or it has method static method calculate pay, and it is returning an reference of this interface. Now what it is doing, the person has to pass salary and the type, and according to the type it will check and return the appropriate class. Now appropriate class object, if it is returning, as these classes are implementing the same interface, so it will return reference to this class, or you can say interface. Now how this is working, now in this form I do have this text box and this combo box. Now what I'm doing is when the person is clicking for calculating the salary, I'm calling this calculate pay method, and I am passing that basic salary which person has inputted and the type he has selected from the combo box, and then this method will return the appropriate object, class object, to the interface. Now I'm getting this object back to the interface. Now in this interface I am calling the get pay method to get the value. Now let me show you how it is working. Let me add one breakpoint. Now suppose I fill 10,000 and I select A, B. Okay, now if I click here it will get me back here. Now if you see right now it is just null. Now when we are going into this class, now as we have this pass the type B, it will return B class officer object. Now when it is returning B class officer object, now if you will see the interface reference, it is telling you it is officer B class officer class type. Now if we are calling this pay method, then it will returning me the right pay. Now what if I just select A and I click here? Now it is returning A class object. Now if you will take your focus, it will say A class officers. Now why the how this is implementing the decoupling? Now the UI, which is we can say the client has no worry about which object it has to retrieve. It is managed by this class. Suppose I have added one more option here for C class. Now for the C class, what I will do is I will implement one more class, C class officer. Let me save few, copy paste. Public, sometimes little copy paste do save. Okay, let me resolve the. Okay, now what I did is I just implemented created new class, and which is implementing the same interface, and suppose I just change the formula, and now what I have to do is I have to add this option within this class. Now I will say if the person has passed class C type C, then class C object it should return. Now let us run our project again. Now I will go for 30,000. Now I will select C and click here. Now again, now initially my I think I just skipped. Okay, let me do it again. Okay, 30,000. Let me select C. Now here in the first go, if you will see, our interface is null. Then we will moving into the class. As we have passed the type C, it will return me the type C object, and then I will be calling this method. Now I think it will make a little bit sense to you right now, how this is working, but for detail you must check this lecture on factory based design pattern, so that it can make you clear how decoupling is happening. So let us make decoupling. Okay, now in this also, if I want to decouple, now I will create a class like class db operation, and I will make a public method, public void, or you can say void, and I will say do task, and in this I will pass this database int object. Now suppose I want to do task connect. Let me make. Now I will say int object dot save, or you can say connect. Now whatever the object I will be passing, this interface will be taking that type of object and will calling the connect. Now suppose if you pass the SQL Server object, it is also implementing the same interface. It will call this connect method. Suppose you have passed db2, then it will call automatically this connect method. So at the runtime this will happen. Okay, now as what we did is we just decouple these concrete classes from like you can say user interface. Now the person has to call this do task connect, and he has to pass the appropriate object, and according to that it will call this connect method. So this is how we can do the decoupling using interface, but while you will studying the factory based design pattern, it will make you more sense. So just please do check that lecture. Now coming toward the advantages. Now one more thing we left is interface act as a digital signature. Now how it acts as digital signature? Now when you are implementing the interface, you are like, it is mandatory for you to implement all the interface methods or members. Now once you have implemented the interface, now you can directly in you can say pass that class object reference to the interface. Now how it can take that reference, because it knows like you must have implemented the interface within that interface. So it acts as a digital signature. The whosoever class has implemented the interface, it is mandatory for them to implement those members. So it is kind of assurance to you, like that class will be containing these methods which are being declared into the interface. So it has act as a digital signature of that class. Now coming toward the advantages, as first we have seen is decoupling of concrete classes from the end to end implementation. Now second, we have done standardization of vocabulary. The third is runtime polymorphism can be achieved. Now let me show you example of this. Now in this what I did is I just created an interface name int rank, and it is just having one method returning a string type. Now this method, three classes I created, like class India, USA and Canada. I have implemented the same interface. Okay, now okay, let me tell you first a little bit definition of polymorphism. Polymorphism is same using same method name multiple time with different you can say arguments and different properties, so that it can we should not be having like different name of same kind of method. So for that you can check the polymorphism lecture, but for now let me concentrate on let me tell you about this one. Now in this what I did is I just created an interface with getRank, and in these three classes I have implemented the same interface. So each of the classes has implemented the method and returning appropriate value. Now for the implementation what I did is I created a list of this interface objects. Okay, now in this what I am adding is, first I added class India, and then I added class Canada, then I added class USA. Now if you see, this is interface list, interface object reference list. So it is kind of will be containing reference to these objects. Okay, now what I am doing is for each object of this list, like member of this list, I am calling this getRank method. Okay, Now let us compile the code from beginning. So first I created the list. If we see, there is no count. Then I added the class, these three classes, and you can see class India, Canada and USA. Now for each member, I will be calling this get rank method. And if I am after this, if I go here, so in the series it has called India rank is 1, Canada rank is 3 and all. And so now you can see at runtime it is deciding this method which from which class this method is which class this method belongs, and it is calling that method even if the method name is same in all of these three classes. Okay, so this is kind of runtime polymorphism you can achieve. Now runtime polymorphism is not directly so easy, like simple to implement. It is kind of simple to implement, but in a lot of cases you will not be using it directly, so it will be little bit complex way of using it, but it is still make you sense like what is runtime polymorphism. What we did is we just created a list of interface, and then we have added the object object of those classes which is implementing that interface, and then we are calling the same method at runtime. So at the runtime it will get to know like which method is coming, which method it has to call, like of which class. Now and now we have covered this third advantage also. Now coming toward the main question of interviews are like what is the difference between interface and abstract class. Now if you haven't seen my lecture on abstract class, you can check the lecture of abstract class, but for the sake of this lecture, let me show you what is abstract class. It is kind of interface which is having abstract methods which are not having any implementation or definition within the abstract class. They just have their implementation is been kept for derived class. It is mandatory for derived class to implement those methods. Now there is one more thing, abstract class can have non-abstract method also which can have their implementation within the class. So now starting with the differences, an abstract class can have abstract members which can be which are override by its derived class. Also it can have non-abstract members. Now this is one of the big difference. Like in interface, the members are implicitly abstract. They don't have their implementation or definition. They are just been declared there. So all members are overridden by its derived class. But in the case of abstract, non-abstract members are not overridden by the derived class. Now the second difference is the member of interface are public with no implementation. No access modifier can be assigned to any members. Now for if the on the interface, if you will go and you will say I want to have public connect and you want to rebuild, it will throw an exception because by default interface members are all public. But even if you want to provide private or something, even then also you cannot implement because we cannot have their access modifier specified within the interface because implicitly they are public, because they are implemented as public members only. Now abstract class can have public or protected abstract members, on also can have non-abstract members, static, public, protected and private too. Now in the abstract class, suppose I want to have this public, but this one I have to have protected. Now if I just try to recompile, it will succeed. Abstract class cannot have private abstract members, but it can have private non-abstract members. Okay, now suppose let us do this private int equal to 100 or 0. Now if I do this, oh sorry, let me just declare it. Now if I try to recompile it, so oh sorry, now I just forgot the variable name. Now if I just recompile it, it will succeed. Now as you can see in interface, non-abstract member abstract class non-abstract member can have public, private and protected, but for the abstract member they can only have public or protected abstract, like you can say access modifier. They cannot go with private because as there is no implementation or definition in there in the abstract method, it is just declaration. So with private declaration you cannot implement it. So that's why the private For the private abstract modifier, you cannot have the implementation within the class, so abstract private access modifier has been banned for this. Now coming toward the next one, like abstract class can add more functionality without destroying the child class. They are using the old version. In interface, creation of additional function will have an effect on its child class, as all the interface members are mandatory to be implemented. Now what this means is, now let us go into the first into the abstract class. Suppose let me add one more public method, get IP, and I return 101 or any random. Okay, now as this is non-abstract member, so if I recompile it, I just added it, there will be no issue, it got succeeded. But in case of interface, let me first decompile it so that it can remove the warnings. Now let me implement like declare one more, like you can say get IP, and now if I just recompile it, it will throw an exception because it is mandatory for child class to have the implementation. So if there is any change in the interface, then it becomes mandatory for those classes, all the child classes, to implement that. But in case of abstract class, if the members which you are adding to the class are non abstract, then it is okay. But if you are adding any abstract method, now suppose if I add one more state or something, and if I just try to recompile, it will again throw me an exception because abstract member need to have implementation. So if you are adding abstract members to the abstract class, then it will act same like the interface. Okay, now if I just try to rebuild, as I implemented the method, it is now succeeding. So it is, but when we are defining an abstract class with abstract method, it has the same effect as of defining the any method, like declaring any method within the interface. Now I think in this lecture I have covered most of the things about interfaces, but still if you have any question, you can contact me through my email ID, through my website, or my phone number, as or my Skype ID. I will be happy to